Welcome back to the world history where forgotten echoes rise again. Today, we begin our journey into the real causes of World War I, a conflict that didn't just erupt overnight. It simmered, festered, and finally exploded with a single gunshot that shook the globe. Our story begins with a blood-red map of Europe. In 1914, the continent was a pressure cooker of fragile alliances, old grudges, and new ambitions. National borders glowed like fuse wires, tense and ready to ignite. Smoke, both literal and symbolic, rose from political hotspots stretching from the Balkans to Berlin. And in the heart of this storm was Sarajevo, June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie rode through the sunlit streets of Sarajevo in an open-top car, smiling, waving, unaware of the shadows creeping in. Crowds lined the route, some cheering, others watching in silence. But hidden among them was Gavrilo Principa, 19-year-old with a pistol and a plan that would change history. Just hours earlier, a failed grenade attack had already rattled the royal procession. But fate, or perhaps a twist of cruel destiny, brought the Archduke's car to a sudden stop right where Princip stood. He raised his gun, 2 shots. Franz and Sophie collapsed. Blood on silk. Silence, then screams. This was no random act. Deep beneath the surface, in the candlelit corners of Serbian basements, a shadowy group called the Black Hand plotted in secrecy. Their goal, liberation for Slavic peoples under Austro-Hungarian rule. Their method, terrorism cloaked in nationalism. Their tool, Gavrilo Princip, the assassination, sent shockwaves across the continent. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the proud, uniformed emperor of Germany, looked across the burning map of Europe. His posture was imperial, but his intentions were far from stable. He saw opportunity in the chaos. Alliances that once promised peace now threatened war. In smoky war rooms, British, French, and Russian generals gathered, their fingers moving, soldiers like chess pieces. Each move brought them closer to the edge. A delicate web of treaties began to unravel, ropes snapping, one by one, dragging nations into conflict like fish caught in a net too tight to escape. In Vienna, the streets erupted with emotion. Crowds cheered for justice. Nationalist fury lit the skies. To many Austrians, the assassination was not a crime, it was a declaration of war, and in the shadows of this chaos, German planners unrolled the infamous Schlieffen-Plane, sweeping military strategy that counted on rapid victory in the West before facing Russia in the East. It was more than a plan. It was a gamble that required total war to succeed. Back in the Balkans, tension mounted. Soldiers stood along cracked borders, rifles raised, nerves frayed. Each side believed the other would blink first. None did. The gunfire in Sarajevo was not just the end of 2 lives. It was the beginning of a war that would drag in empires, redraw the world, and cost millions. The fuse was lit, and no one could stop what was coming. As the smoke of Sarajevo's gunshots drifted across Europe, it didn't take long for deeper fires to ignite. The continent was already soaked in gasoline, and the explosion of nationalism was the spark that caught everything ablaze. Crowds across cities waved their flags not in peace but in fury. Germans, Serbs, Russians, French, each waving their colors as if war was a festival, each shouting their nation's superiority as if destiny itself had given them permission to conquer. A fuse had been burning long before that fatal day in June. It wound through secret treaties, territorial greed, and wounded pride, heading straight for a powder keg labeled Europe 1914. Surrounding it were the very world leaders, who could have stopped it, but instead they watched. Some even smiled. The idea of war wasn't terrifying to them yet. It was exciting, glorious. They believed they could control it. But war has never played by the rules of men. The European empires, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Britain, France, and Russia stood like giants on a sword's edge. Each one was armed, proud, and unyielding. All it would take was one wrong move to send them crashing into chaos. That move had already been made. Across the rail lines of the continent, militarized trains thundered to life. Smoke bellowed into the sky as young men cheered, waving their caps from train windows. They didn't see what awaited them. To them, it was an adventure, a chance to prove themselves. Their faces glowed with courage, but behind the steam, death was already boarding the train. As France and Germany eyed each other across their fortified borders, trenches began to scar the ground. Each side dug in, unwilling to retreat, unable to trust. Hatred had built for decades, fueled by old wars and political betrayals. Now it hardened into steel, uniforms, and machine guns. Europe's leaders, once symbols of authority, had become little more than puppet strings pulled by treaties, generals, and blind public pressure. The alliance system meant that if one domino fell, the rest would tumble fast, and they did. Leaders blinked, then they pointed fingers. Then they mobilized. Imperial rivalry surged at sea. British dreadnoughts patrolled the waves with godlike dominance, casting long shadows over the shrinking German fleet. Each ship was a message. We are watching, we are ready, we will not back down. On land, thousands of young men from Austria-Hungary were pulled into uniform, many barely old enough to shave. They stood under stormy skies, trembling in silence, ordered to defend a dying empire that few of them fully understood. In Serbia, flames of rebellion burned hot. Crowds marched with torches and anti-Austrian signs, their chants echoing through narrow streets. Nationalism was no longer a whisper, it was a roar, and across the globe, colonial soldiers from Africa and Asia were drafted into a war they had no stake in. Confused, uncertain, and far from home, they would soon bleed for empires that saw them only as pawns. This was no longer about an assassination. It was about pride, power, and the illusion of control. Europe was falling into the abyss and dragging the world with it. The fuse had burned to its end, and Europe exploded into chaos. On one side of the screen, German troops poured across Belgium's quiet countryside boots, stomping over neutrality as if it were dust. On the other, in London, a declaration was read with grim resolve. Britain was now at war with Germany. The world shifted in a single moment. Two scenes, one fate. A war that was once avoidable was now unstoppable. Newspapers screamed it across the globe. War declared. In bold ink, printed with the fury of iron presses and panic, headlines flew faster than bullets. People read with wide eyes and pounding hearts, trying to understand how diplomacy had failed so completely, so suddenly. But in truth, it had been failing for years. The alliances that once promised protection had become cages. Leaders of the Triple Alliance and Triple Entente still smiled in photographs and shook hands, but the truth was sharper. Hidden behind their backs were knives, betrayals cloaked in diplomacy, suspicion behind every promise. A map of Europe burned before their eyes. Clocks ticked ominously beside each capital: Berlin, Paris, Vienna, St. Petersburg, London. Midnight loomed. The hour of war had arrived. Across the continent, factories roared to life. Crates of rifles, machine guns, and artillery shells piled high. Tanks, still crude but deadly, rolled out of steelworks. The smoke of industry had transformed into the smoke of war. Millions were being armed not for defense, but for domination. In dim conference rooms, diplomats sat stone-faced, pretending to negotiate while treaties once signed with hope burned beside them, ignored and irrelevant. Paper could no longer hold back bullets. One nation fell, then another. Like dominoes, flags tumbled across Europe's board. Serbia, Russia, Germany, France, Belgium, Britain. No longer independent actors, just pieces in a larger, collapsing design. The machine of war was in motion, and it crushed everything in its path. Amid the chaos, a child clutched a toy soldier as sirens echoed in the distance. His innocence was no shield. Fear now belonged to the young as well as the old. Entire generations would be shaped by what was beginning, not just in body, but in soul. Above this madness, creatures of power tore at the world. A German eagle, a Russian bear, a British lion, and a coiled serpent, symbols of nationalism, pride, and secret influence, all locked in deadly battle over a globe now stained with blood. No side was truly pure. No hands remained clean. And still, behind it all, One moment echoed like a ghost through the trenches now being dug across Europe. The sound of 2 gunshots in Sarajevo. The image of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, falling forward in their open car. That assassination did not cause the war, but it had opened the final door the world had stepped through. There would be no turning back. This was not the beginning of a battle. It was the beginning of a world. Unmade.